You have been taught to open the book at the familiar place, the margin typed by centuries of authority, and to trust that what follows is the whole story. But in a small stone vault high above a terraced valley, under a strip of light that fell like a finger across vellum, another story waited. Written and scraped, folded, and held by hands that lived outside the map of orthodoxy. The vault smelled of old smoke and ink, of goat glue and beeswax, of the lemon tea the guardian offered to guests. A single lamplight trembled as Brother Tikle lifted the lid on the oak chest. Miriam Hale watched without speaking. She had learned to let the silence of such rooms do the talking. When paper breathes, the world leans in to listen. If you will stay with this investigation to the end, if the idea that sacred memory can be contested stirs you, please consider subscribing and activating notifications to follow what comes next. If this story matters, leave a like and share it with someone you know who cares about how the past is kept and who keeps it. Miriam was introduced to manuscripts as a child, in a different kind of darkness, the attic of her grandmother's house, where a bundle of letters and a faded prayer book were stacked beside a seam of ivy. She learned then that objects could carry voices, scratched corrections, marginal prayers, stains where a fingertip had touched a line so often it wore the paper smooth. Those hours shaped her curiosity into vocation. At university, she learned to read hands the way others learned languages. In labs, she learned to handle spores of decay and to coax inks into speech with light beyond the visible. Loss followed. A mentor who died before clarifying a disputed reading. A brief marriage that dissolved under the pressure of fieldwork and distance. The solitude that remained became a discipline, a decision to be the kind of listener who would spend whole winters following the traces left by others. Where some saw fragments, Miriam saw questions about authority, exclusion, the cost of forgetting. The collection under the monastery's chapel had been catalogued long enough to earn a local legend. 14 books kept apart, seldom read in public liturgy, each a witness to practices and ideas that did not fit neatly into later orthodoxies. They were not a single genre. Some were sagas, long narratives that wove saints and tricksters with miracle and law. Others were apocalypses, visions of angelic hierarchies and fallen beings. A few were wisdom texts, aphoristic and practical, structured for households rather than councils. A handful belonged to the same family as known pseudo-epigrapha, works attributed to ancient figures composed in later centuries, arguing different calendars, different rites of purification, different ways of conceptualizing the powers that shaped the world. To hold such a book was to hold disagreement. To read it aloud in a parish might unravel certainties about who spoke with apostolic authority, who could set the rhythm of holy time. That is why these texts had an awkward place in the archive, neither secret in the sense of conspiratorial, nor public in the sense of approved liturgy. They were living witnesses carried by communities that had for generations chosen memory over conformity. The monastery where Miriam had come was itself a geography of resistance. Built on basalt terraces and lapped by terraces of olive and thyme, its chapel faced east where the dawn first touched the valley. The brothers still chanted an old office whose calendar diverged subtly. Holy days shifted by a few days, fasts kept at different seasons. Habte, the village elder who sometimes assisted the brothers during harvest, called the place the house with a different clock. Their custody of the books was ancestral. Brother Tikle, who guided Miriam that morning, was not an archivist in the modern sense. His care had been learned from a line of hands that mended tears with thread pulled from their own garments, whose margins contained prayers known only to them. He handled the parchments as if they were relatives. Daniel, the conservator who had flown in from the capital, moved through the scriptorium like a cautious surgeon. He wore nitrile gloves, his kit snapped shut into boxes that made metallic clicks as they opened. Tweezers, brushes with soft sable, a syringe for consolidants measured in microdrops. He spoke little, but when he did, he translated the technical into the human. "This glue is old. It smells like the kitchens where they bound these books," he said. And then, "We can stabilize this, but nothing we do should erase the palimpsest beneath." Martha, the translator, carried a leather notebook full of transcriptions and gossip, a bridge between the cursive of the scribe Lema and the voices in the valley. Sarah Levin, the visiting professor, arrived in tidy coats and sharper questions. Her validation of findings promised academic cachet, but also the threat of appropriation the brothers feared. Bishop Morrow wrote letters of polite concern, liturgical uniformity and pastoral care, he said, but in his tone Miriam heard the risk of expropriation, that sacred objects might be moved, catalogued, and made to serve narratives that erased local memory. The 14 books varied as much as the hands that wrote them. One was a household manual, named by the brothers the Book of Small Rites. Its recipes for blessed bread and protective knots written in an easy hand. Another, called by the village singers the Long Watch, narrated a festival where angels were invoked by names that did not appear in canonical lists. The so-called Book of the Two Calendars argued in a dense legalistic hand for the legitimacy of a lunar cycle reckoning that determined the timing of the harvest fasts and marriage seasons.
There were apocalyptic fragments, visions of watchers, of giants born from forbidden unions, that the elders quoted only to explain a seasonal rite of scattering seeds as a ward against drought. Across the texts ran themes that had become controversial in the councils of later centuries, authority claimed by local elders rather than centralized bishops, rituals that involved embodied practices rather than book-bound liturgy, calendars that anchored community identity against imperial uniformity. Miriam's first task was inventory, but inventory here meant listening. She opened pages with a quiet gesture, touching the surface as one might touch a sleeping face. The vellum had the warmth of a thing that had been read. She looked for marginal annotations, glosses that might indicate use, slips of paper that carried later notes, palimpsest layers where older texts had been scraped away and overwritten. With Daniel, she transported select folios to the laboratory, its white benches and steady light a counterpoint to the chapel's lamplight. In the lab, the sounds changed, the metallic clink of instruments, the faint hum of imaging equipment, the soft rustle of paper when a folio was turned. Multispectral imaging bathed a page in bands of light, infrared, ultraviolet, bringing to the surface inks that the eye could not see. Radiocarbon tests would place dates within ranges, not certainties. Paleography would suggest hands and generations. Together, the methods created a chorus of evidence, each with its own uncertainties and interpretive edges. The conversations among the custodians and scholars were careful and sometimes sharp. Bishop Morrow spoke of unity and pastoral clarity. Hidden divergences endanger the flock, he said, his voice wrapped in institutional concern. Sarah Lavon countered with scholarly language. Canons developed over centuries, she reminded the assembly. The presence of variant liturgies reveals a historical pluralism, not merely dangerous anomaly. Habte, who had turned pages his entire life without ever writing a line, told a story of when a procession had been stopped by officials who found the community's calendar out of step with the bishopric. Lemma, the scribe, listened, hands folded, mouthing phrases that were neither academic nor clerical, but local, words that measured grief when festivals were broken. Each voice revealed motives for exclusion that were layered. Theological discomfort at alternative Christologies or angelologies. Political desire for a centralized calendar that made taxation and conscription administratively neat. Economic pressures when rival centers sought to control pilgrim routes and the relics that drew them. And liturgical pressure, where local rites were seen as impediments to ecclesial unity. Miriam recorded these debates in small notebooks that smelled faintly of glue. She wrote not to resolve them, but to preserve the textures of argument.
In one evening meeting, Daniel leaned back and said, almost to himself, "None of this is simply doctrinal. When a calendar changes, people lose their festivals. When a festival goes, the bread at a household table is altered. That is cultural erasure." Martha translated that sentence into the shared idiom among the brothers and villagers. We do not only lose a book, we lose a year. When the technical work began in earnest, the pace shifted. Imaging sessions ran late into cold hours. The lab's monitors glowed like pale altars as teams compared bands of light. Miriam sat between the worlds, the dim roofs of the village beyond the lab's windows, and the phosphorescent images on the screen. One night, tired and alone, she found a photograph of an old calendar in the margins of a legal codex, and noticed an annotation that did not match the bishopric's registry. The annotation referenced a festival in which a chorus of women sang the names of protective angels in juxtaposition to a list found in an apocryphal apocalypse. That mismatch, small on the surface, suggested a divergence that could push back the assumed dates of local liturgical practice by decades. The discovery of the palimpsest came the way most revelations do in archival work, as a mix of patience, humility, and an apparatus of light. Daniel had prepared a folio whose reverse bore a later homily. The front had faint traces of letters beneath the surface. Under multispectral imaging, the lower hand at first suggested fragments, an invocation here, a roster of names there, until in the infrared band, whole lines unfolded, like the whisper of a tide revealing a buried shore. Miriam felt her fingers go cold. The undertext contained not only familiar names, but an arrangement of rites that placed a local bishop, named differently than in official registers, at the center of a network that predated the formation of the regional episcopal seat. If validated, this would not merely be an antiquitarian anomaly. It might demonstrate an alternative axis of authority that the later institutional history had marginalized. Word of such a possibility breathed through the scriptorium like incense, stirring both hope and alarm.
Habte clasped his hands and said, "If they find what you think, they will tell us to give them the books." Brother Tikle answered with aged calm, "Then we must show them that books are not pipes to be moved for profit." The room split between people who thought that broader access and scholarly publication were the moral imperative of preservation, and those who feared dislocation, that the book's meanings would be stripped when lifted from context. Miriam knew that the path ahead required more than imaging. Radiocarbon would help with dating, but samples needed permission. The brothers feared damage. The local council would need to consent to any invasive test.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é um narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era: Ansel would need to consent to any invasive test. De Sarah Levan argumentou por rápida publicação, prioridade em escolaridade, mas Daniel urged patience. We can tell a preliminary story, but if we rush, we risk writing the narrative others will use to justify him removal. The ethical stakes were not abstract. Outside the monastery, a museum had already hinted informally at curatorial interest. An offer to digitize the corpus came with clauses that implied rights to images and reproductions. The villagers, whose festivals were entwined with those pages, suspected that preservation in the hands of the capital often meant extraction. Miriam's own inner life threaded through these public negotiations. In the small hours, she thought of the attic in her grandmother's house, the way a margin could be a finger pointing back to a past day of grief or joy. She felt the responsibility of the listener, to make the voices legible without letting them be commandeered. Her four-part backstory, childhood curiosity, an apprenticeship in the craft of reading hands, a loss that taught her the fragility of memory, and the decision to listen rather than to classify, showed up in these moments as a steady ethic. She moved between lab bench and council table, between imaging screens and the brothers' refectory, never entirely at ease in any role, but emerging as a mediator who insisted on consent, who insisted that preservation meant partnership. The moment the undertext revealed its full line, Miriam stepped back from the monitor and felt the strip of light through the lab window fall across her knuckles, the same narrow gold that had first touched the chest in the vault. The words were not miraculoso, they were municipal. Letters naming local rites, calendrical markers, a feast named for a patron who was local rather than apostolic. Yet in their mundanity lay force. They suggested that this community had authored its own liturgical geography, and that later authorities had either overwritten or marginalized that geography in the work of creating a single map of orthodoxy. The reaction was immediate and varied. Bishop Maro requested copies of the images and proposed a joint committee. His letter offered cooperation while containing thinly veiled language of stewardship. Sarah Levan prepared an abstract for a journal, tempted by the rarity of the data. Daniel worried aloud about samples. We can only microsample, the brothers must approve. Habte and Brother Teklai worried about children and songs. If calendars changed, would the children be taught to sing different names? Martha sat with the elderly singers, translating the undertext aloud in the monastery kitchen, while the scent of bread rose. Lema, who had been the church's hand for generations, watched the images and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was a small thing. Words on the page are like seeds. They remember the seasons. Pressure comenzó.
An emissary from the regional cultural authority visited with forms and polite words about digitization for wider access. The language of access was persuasive. Images would be preserved, scholars around the world could read the texts, and the community's voice would be heard. But there was also the implication, unstated but present, that digital copies would allow control of the narrative. Miriam felt the tension acutely. She was not the keeper of the monastery's platitudes. She was a mediator who worried that, absent careful agreements, the community would receive the book only as an object in a database rather than as part of a living ritual practice. Late one evening, after a day of meetings, Miriam walked the terrace path with Hopday. The valley smelled of crushed herbs and wet stone. Children played near the fountain. Their voices were a counterpoint to the low conversations about curatorial rights. Hopday led her to a place where the old festival still stored its shards, a small chapel annex filled with cloths and a wooden chest. He pulled a strip of linen from beneath the chest and handed it to her. The cloth had been used to wrap a codex for a procession. Its weave carried stains, saffron perhaps, or grit from 100 feet walking the flange of the terraces, and a human thumbprint pressed into the fold. This, Hopday said, is how we carry our books. We carry them with our hands, not with signatures. Miriam thought of radiocarbon, of metadata, of articles and committees. She thought also of the thumbprint, an index of touch that no database could replicate. Back in the lab, the palimpsest continued to yield readings. Under the visible homily, lines of an older text spoke of bishops who had convened not to centralize liturgy, but to adjudicate local disputes over water and land. A reminder that ecclesial power had been entangled with mundane governance. Another line sketched a rite for blessing seed before sowing, invoked in the name of angels peculiar to the valley, and not found in canonical angelologies. Those lines, when brought forward, reframed the reasons why some texts were left out of the canon. Inclusion and exclusion were as much about governance, about who could regulate calendars and taxes and festivals, as they were about dogma. Rumors then moved faster than the images. A reporter from the Capitol phoned asking for an interview. An offer from a funding body proposed digitization contingent on open licensing that would allow global distribution. Miriam received appeals from students who wanted to help with transcription, and from elders who feared that their rights would be parceled into academic articles. The ethical knot tightened. How to balance scholarly transparency with the rights of a community to determine how their memory is presented.
On a rainy morning, as the brothers chanted, Miriam sat at the long wooden table in the refectory and drafted a proposal, a stewardship plan that would keep the physical books in the monastery, allow in situ digitization supervised by the community, and establish a shared governance board, including the brothers, village representatives, and external scholars. The proposal argued for slow scholarship, transparent methods, community consent for sampling, and co-authored publications that foregrounded local voices. It refused, gently but firmly, the model of extraction that had become commonplace. The archive emptied of people and then declared universal. When she presented it in the council chamber, Bishop Morrow listened with a measured face. Sarah Lavon nodded at points,
already imagining footnotes that could name the monastery as a primary source of previously unknown rites. Yet not everyone welcomed delay. A museum curator, who had visited and admired the leather and the hands that held it, wrote a private note proposing an exhibition that would bring international attention and funding. The brothers were tempted. The display of the books could fund restorations and support the village in hard seasons. But Daniel and Miriam both feared that objects lifted from living practice would be recontextualized into artifacts of the past, silent in glass cases. There was also the latent power play. Control of narrative often follows control of objects. Whoever hosted the exhibition could frame the book's meaning through captions and curatorial choices. The struggle crystallized around one procedural question: sampling for radiocarbon dating. The lab required tiny samples to narrow ages, but any removal would scar the folio. The brothers consulted their memories and their prayers. Habte and Tikle argued they would not consent without guarantees. Shared custody of results, written clauses preventing removal, a promise of community consultation before any public dissemination. Bishop Morrow argued that the broader church had an interest in historic clarity. Sarah Lavon emphasized scientific value. Miriam mediated, insisting on ethics. She proposed a ceremonial sampling. An older brother would bless the act as an acknowledgement of continuity, and the laboratory would record the process as a ritual of partnership, not extraction. When the sampling finally occurred, Martha read aloud an ancient prayer as Daniel took a microsample, a filament of twisted vellum so small it looked like a hair. The sample went into a tube and then into a courier's manifest. The tube would travel to a lab where dates would be spoken in ranges and probabilities. But the symbolic act mattered. The community had placed a voice beside the instrument. The line between archaeology and ritual had been intentionally blurred. And in that blurring, Miriam saw a new form of guardianship forming.
Then, as the radiocarbon results began to reach provisional numbers, and the palimpsest's text became clearer under the patient work of paleography, the undertext offered a phrase that cut through assumptions. An administrative note signed with a name the valley still remembered. An elder's ancestor, once a mediator between local councils. That single name suggested a continuity of governance that had been elided by later histories. Scholars would call it anachronistic or regional. For the villagers, it was proof that their festivals and calendars were not mere local quirk, but expressions of a long-standing civic order. Arguments multiplied. Bishop Morrow, seeing the possible implication for ecclesial unity, pushed for a public statement emphasizing the value of integrating local traditions into the broader life of the church. Sarah Levin saw an article with headline potential. The museum clerk offered an exhibition timeline that would coincide with a national anniversary. Habte proposed a different approach, a local festival reinstated in partnership with neighboring villages, a living act of recognition that would animate the texts instead of removing them to a museum case. Miriam found herself at the center of a decision that asked more of her than scientific detachment. To resolve matters would require more than analysis. It would require political judgment, moral courage, and the ability to craft agreements that protected the dignity of the custodians. She walked one evening to the scriptorium and opened the chest where the 14 books slept.
The lamplight traced a strip of gold across the top folio, the same light that had first drawn her here. She laid her palm upon the cover and felt, in the faint warmth, the persistence of hands that had kept these pages safe. The palimpsest's next revelation would change everything, or perhaps simply complicate the conversation. The undertext contained a list of rights tied to a social order that suggested an alternative map of authority, one that had been quietly effective for generations. If that map was recognized, it would force regional institutions to confront a past they had smoothed into a narrative of unity. If it was ignored, the valley's calendars and festivals might be reinterpreted as quaint anomalies and folded into a larger archive that did not owe the community any agency. Miriam closed the folio and walked out to the terrace. Below, a child ran fingers along a stone step where generations had scored names to mark the days. The child's touch echoed the archive's thumbprint. Miriam thought of light on the page, of the way revelation often appears as an ordinary brightness, sun through a window, a lamp tilted at the right angle. She understood that the struggle ahead would not be resolved by one image or one dating test. It would be fought in meetings and in kitchens, in journals and in festival squares, in legal forms and in songs.
They were not yet at the point of public reckoning. There were more tests to run, more conversations to shape, more agreements to be written in ink that would bind rather than take. But the palimpsest's voice had been coaxed into enough clarity to demand a response. The question was not only what the 14 books had to tell historians, it was what the community and the institutions willing to listen would do with that knowledge. Miriam blew out the lamp in the lab and took the narrow stair down to the vault, her steps echoing in the stone. The chest sat under the same strip of light, patient as ever. She opened it and, with a steady hand, lifted the top book. The page she laid open bore the ghost of the old ink beneath the new, a list of names, a calendar note, a notation that tied a rite to a particular spring. She traced the faded line with her finger, careful not to touch the ink, and felt in that small motion the continuity of 1,000 small acts of care. Outside, a child's laugh rose and then fell. Miriam closed the book and, for the first time since the imaging began, felt the shape of a possible resolution. Not neat and final, but a covenantal way forward that might allow the 14 books to remain at the hands that had loved them, while sharing their voices with a wider world that listened with humility rather than claiming ownership. It would be slow. It would be contentious. It would, she hoped, be just. The next morning would bring meetings and letters and perhaps a public statement. But for now, under the strip of light like a narrow gold across the text, Miriam allowed herself a small gratitude. Gratitude for the hands that had kept the books, for the science that could read the palimpsest, and for the possibility that memory might be stitched back into life. She turned the folio closed and placed it gently back into the chest. The coffin's lid lowered like a palm. The light fell across its oak rim, and for a moment the glow made the wood look like a page itself, waiting to be opened again. Dawn arrived thin and pallid, the terraces washed in the pale that had visited the lab the night before. Miriam dressed without haste, folding the scrap of paper into the inner pocket of her coat, as if that small list could be shielded by cloth. The refectory bell had not yet called. The valley moved in slow, deliberate rhythms. Bread ovens, a woman hauling water, a boy beating a drum in practice for the chorus. Even the dogs took their time. The council chamber sat above the market, its windows catching the day like panes of old glass. Miriam climbed the narrow steps and felt the boards reply beneath her weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and old ink. Around the long table, the familiar faces had already gathered. The valley's elders, the head of the archives board, representatives from the university, and two young people who had been the book's keepers since childhood. There were chairs enough for disagreement.
Armand, director of the archive, opened the meeting with a practiced, measured voice. "We have evidence now," he said, and the words made the chestnut beams vibrate. "The imaging is clear. There is scholarly value, public value. There will be offers." Offers. The word hung like a coin on its edge. Miriam set her hands on the scrap of paper and breathed through the first rattling of nerves. She spoke last. She had let others name advantage and opportunity and danger. Now she unfolded her plan. "We are not, as a matter of taste, choosing between secrecy and publication," she said. "We are choosing how a people's memory will be kept alive. The 14 books are not raw data. They are active practices. If we take them and place them in a central repository, we risk turning rights into artifacts. We must insist on agreements that bind institutions to community care." Jonas, who had spent long nights at the imaging console, leaned in. "Technically," he said, "we can make perfect facsimiles. We can host scans, metadata, the whole corpus. We can make it accessible worldwide." "And lose the context," Lila answered quietly, the woman who had been childhood keeper and now spoke with an elder steadiness. "You would have the words without the hands that lit the lamps, or the songs that rose on the threshing floors. The right is not complete on a screen." Armand's jaw tightened. "We must also consider preservation. Books rot. Funding bodies want public access. The university could secure grants that would pay for conservation for decades." Miriam looked at him, and then at the two young keepers. "Preservation and access should be the joint labor of those who care for the books and those who can care with resources. Co-authorship on publications. Custodial agreements that prioritize in situ care. Legal language that prevents unilateral transfer. We can design exhibitions in the refectory, on the terraces, where the community decides when and how rights are shared." An elder who had not spoken until then, Thomas, cleared his throat. His hands were roughened by years of tending terraces. His voice carried the weight of seasons. "Our ancestors hid these books in a chest, not for secrecy alone, but for the right time. If they were meant to be known widely, they would have been taken to the city. There is a cost to this knowledge. We must be careful." "We are asking for care," Miriam said, "not circumspection that freezes the books under glass, but a covenant to teach, to renew, to let the younger ones learn, to allow scholars to come only with the community's blessing and with the promise to share authorship of whatever comes from those encounters. A representative from the funding board, who until then had taken notes in a neat hand, raised an objection about precedent and liability. The conversation thickened. Lawyers' phrasing, grant cycles, public relations.
Jonas offered her a cup of bitter tea and a second monitor that showed a high-resolution reveal of an undertext line, a margin note that mentioned a spring festival and a woman's name she did not yet know. "Who keeps the names?" Miriam whispered. "For now, we keep asking," Jonas said, smiling briefly. "For now, we listen." Outside, in the market, a stranger moved through the stalls, a reporter from the city, a man with a notebook and an inquisitive face. He paused beneath a cloth awning and listened to a child sing. His presence would complicate the 6-week forum, or, perhaps, force it to happen sooner. Miriam watched him and felt the weight of the valley's choice. To let the past be read and taught on their terms, or to watch it be written into someone else's ledger. She gathered her coat and the small folded list and walked down to the vault once more before the chest would be summoned for the working group's viewing. The iron lock slid open with its familiar groan. The books lay as they had the night before, patient in their chest. Miriam set her hand upon oak, recalled the strip of moon, and thought of the lit lamp on the page. There was much work to do, letters to draft, language to sharpen, alliances to build. But there was, too, the immediate labor of presence, to sit with the keepers, to teach their children how to read a line without flattening its context, to ensure that when the books left the chest, they left with hands that loved them. She closed the chest gently, breathed in the scent of old pages, and understood that preservation would demand not only method, but humility. Outside, a drumbeat rose, children practicing the newly recovered cadence. Miriam stepped into that sound and walked toward the market, toward the public notice board where the poster for the forum would soon be pinned, toward a valley that would have to learn together how to hold what it had found. Rain began, at first as a whisper on the eaves, then in earnest, washing the terrace stones clean. Miriam folded up her list and tucked it close. In the coming weeks, she thought, they would need translators of law and translators of song, people who could turn clauses into ritual and ritual into protections. They would need patience. The road down to the refectory glistened. She moved through the rain with the folded scrap like a talisman, thinking of hands, of pages, and of the covenant they were trying to write. One line at a time, one ceremony at a time, until memory and life were braided again. Miriam spent the next days as if she were assembling a fragile instrument. The clauses she drafted were precise in the way of someone who had spent a life coaxing meaning from brittle paper. Definitions of custody and stewardship, a schedule for supervised viewings, terms for reproductions that privileged performative transmission over image. She insisted on plain language, no legalese to obscure ceremony, and on a reversion clause so strict that any violation would return the books to the chest and to the keeper's sole guardianship until trust was rebuilt. Jonas became her partner in patience. Between imaging sessions, he brought fragments of the undertext to the keepers, showing them traces of ink that neither of them had noticed at first glance. In the worn margin, there came, with the light turned just so, a single name and a line about a springtime rite. Amina keeps the rites at the first rising of the green. The ink was shaky, as if the hand had trembled with the cold of a dawn. Miriam read it aloud, and the syllables seemed to settle into the room. "Amina," said Rahim, one of the older keepers, without surprise. "I remember my mother saying a name like that, one who taught the children songs and how to braid the cloth." Najla, another keeper, touched the printed image with a fingertip, as if the pixel were a real paper. "Amina," she echoed. "There was a woman. My aunt used to speak of a woman who saved recipes and lullabies during the hunger. She did not keep them in a chest. She kept them in people." The discovery did not answer everything. It offered a direction. The working group's first meeting took place in a refectory arranged with the awkward courtesy of people who were not yet sure whether they were partners or opponents. There were elders from the valley, professors who had read footnotes for a living, a civil lawyer who could turn ritual into enforceable sentences, and two keepers selected by consensus, Rahim and Najla. Jonas was there with his laptop and his patience. The reporter from the city, the man with the notebook, sat in the back and watched like someone taking the measure of a new world. Miriam presented her draft with the steady voice she used in the lab, clear, spare, attentive to fact and to the life behind it. She proposed not only legal protections, but practical enactments. A spring festival anchored to the first green buds. A rota of keepers and scholars who would present the books in community spaces without ever displacing them. An apprenticeship that would teach children ritual as much as reading. There were objections. Some scholars argued the scans must be archived to guard against loss. A representative from the regional museum, whose letters offered money and expertise, suggested a partnership that read like rescue. "Think of safekeeping," he said. "Climate control, conservation labs, these are not dangers, they are solutions." Najla shook her head gently. "Our songs were not saved by being put under glass," she said. "They were saved by being song. If there is to be safekeeping, it must be of the hands that hold them." They argued at the table and away from it. Rahim spoke of trust, that the keepers had learned how to be erased by promises that looked like protection. The elders spoke of custom, that the books had never belonged to a single family, but to a people who gathered around them. The lawyer spoke of precedent and of enforcement. Jonas, who had watched the undertext reveal a woman connected to an old rite, proposed a compromise. A program of traveling workshops led by keepers and accompanied by modest, non-digital reproductions. Pages rendered on handmade paper, presented as experience rather than object. "Carry the tradition," he said, "not the thing that can be sold." Over the weeks, Miriam drafted and redrafted, listening more than she spoke. She met with Rahim in his courtyard beneath grape trellises, and with Najla by the fountain where children washed their palms. She sat with the keeper's children, small, serious faces intent on the line, and taught them the careful measurements of ink, how a letter held breath, how a smear could be traced into a melody. She taught them to light a lamp before an opened page and to place a pressed flower gently, not as ornament, but as witness. The reporter wrote his piece the morning the working group issued its provisional memorandum. He came early to the refectory and stayed late, and when his article ran with the line, "Valley debates custody of living texts," the town stirred. Some readers were outraged on principle. "The university should have full access," said one editorial. Others were afraid the valley would be swallowed by tourists and journalists and scholars who meant well, but moved like machines for whom meaning was data. There were letters of support for the keepers, petitions emerging from students, offers of funding from unexpected donors. The forum, scheduled for 6 weeks, began to loom like a bell. Miriam feared 2 things: that fear itself would scatter the keepers, and that decisions made in haste would injure what they aimed to protect. She and Jonas insisted the forum be public but structured, a place where listening could still happen. They proposed format: a short presentation, statements by keepers, time for community responses, then small group deliberations. The lawyer worked with Rahim and Najla to translate ritual elements into enforceable language. The museum representative refined his offer into a conditional partnership: climate-controlled assistance only if the chest remained in the valley and the keepers retained veto. Even within the valley, consent was not easy. There were those who wanted the books moved to the safety of the city, where there are vaults and staff to guard them. There were those who wanted the texts opened to scholars so that knowledge might be recovered for the good of all. There were those who simply wanted the chest to remain undisturbed and hidden for another generation. The forum became a test of whether a community could argue itself into a promise.
Day arrived under a sky that had been clear all morning, and then around midday softened into a promise of rain. The refectory filled with the kind of attendance that is both intimate and raw. Farmers and teachers, old keepers with arms like oaken beams, mothers with children asleep at their breasts, university students carrying notebooks, the reporter in the corner. 5 rows of chairs were arranged facing a long table where the working group sat. The chest's image projected, not the pages, only the chest and the lamp as an emblem. Miriam opened with the facts: how the books had been found, the imaging results, the condition of the bindings, and then stepped aside. Rahim stood and told the story of the chest as it had been told to him. His voice was not loud, but it carried an authority that comes from memory. He spoke of a time when the valley had been thirsty, and the songs had been the only water. Najla read a line from the margin aloud, letting Amina's name hang in the room. When she finished, a child in the back, perhaps 6 years old, began to sing a phrase that the keeper's apprentices had practiced, a half-remembered cadence that seemed to belong to reeds and to water. The sound moved through the room like light through glass. Conversations fell away. Someone in the back wept softly. The reporter set down his pen. The museum representative, who had come prepared with charts and conditions, looked like a man who had briefly forgotten how to speak. Then the speeches began proper. An academic argued for wide access so that the texts could be studied and their knowledge used. A teacher from a neighboring village said that the valley's practices might offer a model for shared guardianship. A woman who had once been an apprentice to a keeper spoke about what it meant to have song taught to you in your mother's kitchen, not in a reading room. A heated intervention came from a city council delegate calling for centralized custody. They argued that piecemeal protections would not survive the pressures of tourism and interest. Rahim answered not with law, but with a story, of a lute broken in transit, of a melody that two men tried to conserve and in the process erased. Conservation without the hands, he said, is theft dressed in gloves. There were formal proposals. Miriam presented her clauses and the festival plan. A spring rite to be guided by keepers. A festival that would not exhibit pages, but would revive the experience, chants, recipes, dances, apprenticeships, so that knowledge circulated in embodied form. Jonas showed prototypes of handmade reproductions to be carried by traveling teams to be used in workshops. The lawyer explained enforcement mechanisms, a charter registered with the regional council, a reversion clause triggered by breach, penalties that focused on restoration of trust more than fines. When the time for public response was opened, people divided into small groups as planned.
The room filled with voices that were at once plaintive and pragmatic. How many times could a given keeper rotate? Who would grant access to scholars? Could the museum's climate control offer be used in situ? People argued, revised, softened positions. In one group, a young teacher suggested an exchange program. Scholars could come for residencies, but abide by rules co-authored with the keepers. In another, an old woman insisted on an oath, a small ritual to be recited before any viewing that would place moral obligation above paperwork. The child who had sung earlier returned to the front at the end of the day and, without asking, joined the keepers as they made a formal statement. The child spoke simply, "We want them to stay with the people who know the songs." The simplicity of it broke through the last stubborn defenses. Applause rose, not the empty, perfunctory kind, but real, as if the room had made a small, unanimous decision. The working group convened one final time at dusk. The rain began again, softening into a sound that seemed to mark the deliberation as something that had been watered into being. The memorandum they signed that night was not the absolute victory anyone had dreamed of, nor the total surrender feared by others. It contained compromises and it contained music. Key points. The chest remained in the valley under joint guardianship. The keepers had the primary custodial authority. The working group would oversee limited, community-led replicative programs and traveling experiential exhibitions. High-resolution imaging would be created, but access to the files would be mediated. Scholars could request residency, and programs would encourage embodied transmission rather than detached cataloging. The festival, Amina's Right, Resurrected, would be the annual anchor. Enforcement would be through a charter registered with the regional council and a reversion clause, strong enough to make the removal of pages beyond the valley a legal impossibility without unanimous consent. The reporter's piece that followed the forum emphasized the unusual nature of the agreement, a combination of law and ritual, of clauses written beside songs. Some voices complained that the arrangement would slow discovery. Others celebrated a quieter kind of victory, the idea that knowledge might be protected by culture rather than locked away by vaults. When the chest was opened again, for the first time in public since its discovery, it was inside a tent beside the refectory where the festival began. The keepers had arranged reed mats and candles. The lamp that had been mentioned in the margin was lit and placed at the chest's edge by Najla, who had been taught the light's care by an aunt, and who moved as if she were handing down a breathing thing. Miriam watched the pages, the lamp, the faces.
Rahim read aloud, and where the letters were too faded, the keepers sang what had been remembered. A line for rain, a line for the first green, a line for hands. The children stepped forward with baskets. They sang and offered bread. The pressed flour Miriam had carried since the first night was set upon the oak beside the open chest, an offering that smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Amina's name was spoken several times. Najla told the story the keepers had preserved, that Amina had taught not by locking the books, but by gathering people. It was not a reconstruction so much as an invocation. The crowd responded with a chorus that had been stitched together from memory and training, a cadence not perfect but insistently present. Miriam felt something in the chest of her own ribs loosen and tremble like an instrument retuned. The festival was not a token. It was an education in presence, an insistence that knowledge be held within a living practice. There were awkward moments. A scholar who asked for a look at underscores, a donor who arrived late hoping to change terms. But these were folded into the day as friction that formed part of the learning. When the evening closed, the keepers placed a cloth over the chest and moved the lamp out into the square. People lingered, talking in small clusters about apprenticeships, about the ways to teach a child a chant rather than a citation. Miriam walked among them, accepting more thanks than she could reasonably take. Jonas joined her, and for once neither of them had anything urgent to examine. They stood under the tent's eaves as the rain began, light and even, washing the stones until the square shone. Later, when silence stretched and the children slept at their parents' feet, the keepers met in a circle and whispered of the work ahead. The rota of guardians, the training of apprentices, the careful recording of terms, the ways to hold scholars accountable to ritual. They spoke of Amina as if she were both memory and instruction. Rahim suggested a line he wanted engraved on the chest itself, something simple. Here we keep what keeps us. Miriam offered the pressed flour to be kept among the cloths that lined the chest, as a witness that the choices had been made in listening and not in the cold of argument. Najla pressed it flat between two sheets and laid it gently where the keepers said it should be. Then they closed the lid, not to sever curiosity, but to promise stewardship. In the days that followed, the festival became an annual expectation. The traveling workshops went to neighboring villages and came back with new songs braided into the valley's own. Scholars who wished to work with the texts came for residencies and learned to bow before a line, to ask permission, to sit with a keeper and a child and listen. The museum sent technicians who taught the keepers how to care for bindings. They did not archive the books elsewhere.
O guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. O contexto de continuidade era: Dings, they did not archive the books elsewhere. Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. The regional council recorded the charter and the reversion clause, giving it a legal force that matched its ritual weight. The reporter returned months later with an article that carried a gentleness not often found in headlines. A place keeps its books. He quoted a child who said plainly, "They are stories that want to be sung." He quoted Najla and Rahim, and, in a brief aside, Miriam. The valley received the notice with the same unassuming pride one has when a neighbor plants a tree that will bear fruit long after the planter has been gone. Miriam kept coming back to the chest. She continued to teach the keeper's apprentices how to read a letter like a face, how to be attentive to the lacuna between lines. She edited documents and negotiated terms, and, when the legal world demanded precision, she wrote clauses with the same care she brought to fragile threads. She found that law and ritual could be braided, but only if each braided part acknowledged the other's fragility. One evening, months after the festival, Jonas called her to the lab. There, under the lamp's quiet light, he showed her a new detail in the undertext, a recipe notation that matched a dish the keepers had prepared during the festival. The margin had a tiny symbol, 3 dots arranged like a tiny cluster of grapes, and beside it a word translated as "to share." Miriam smiled until she felt it in the bones. The undertext had been more than history. It was instruction. They placed that image, with permission from the keepers, into an apprenticeship booklet the valley produced. It was not a scanned page for an archive, but a pedagogical page for hands. How to make a bread for the festival, how to call a chant into being, how to place a pressed flower. It traveled with the keepers on their workshops. People who saw it learned that preservation could be a form of hospitality. Years later, when the children who had sung at the first public opening were themselves teachers, Miriam walked the terrace where the chorus had practiced that first afternoon. The terrace was greener. The square below had an extra bench where a grandmother sat and taught her granddaughter a melody. The chest was still there, and the lamp still at its side. The festival continued. Amina's name was spoken each spring like a prayer and like a map. Miriam understood then that protection had not been a single act, but an ongoing labor of presence. The work of sitting with the keepers, of writing clauses that honored ritual, of translating law into a language that respected song. She had thought once that preservation meant keeping the books untouched. She had been wrong. Preservation, she had learned, was keeping the hands that knew the books. On a late afternoon, as rain softened against the eaves and children practiced a cadence by the fountain, she walked to the chest and set her palm upon the oak. The pressed flower beneath the lid had browned with time, but its outline was clear.